Good afternoon, and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program Information Session, Project Narrative and Statement of Work. Before I begin, I'd like to take you through the items you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you have problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure you're not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you are, exit the webinar, download the Adobe Connect desktop application, and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. In the troubleshooting tips pod at the bottom left of your dashboard are some internet, network, video, and audio troubleshooting tips to ensure that participants can both hear and see the presentation. Next to the troubleshooting tips pod is the web links pod, which contains links to useful resources related to the Fed-State Partnership Program. To view the links, double-click the title of the link. At the bottom right of the Adobe Connect dashboard is a technical support pod. This is where you can ask our support team questions about our technical issues you are having. Above the technical support pod is the questions for presenters pod for the questions and answer session. This is where you can ask questions that will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Thank you all of you who submitted pre-webinar questions. Please note that a recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to FRA's website in about a week. The presentation file will be available about 24 hours from now. Before the presentation begins, I would like to review the webinar format. We will start with a brief welcome and then launch into the presentation. Following the presentation portion of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session during which FRA will address your pre-webinar questions and those posted in the questions for presenters pod. And now, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Jenny Zhang, Transportation Industry Analyst in the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division at the Federal Railroad Administration.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I am Jenny Zhang. I'm a Transportation Industry Analyst at FRA. We're really glad that you are all joining us today for our Fed-State Partnership National Office Hours on Project Narrative and Statement of Work Best Practices. This is our third webinar on the Fed-State Partnership Program to hopefully give you guys some more context and insight into how to best prepare your applications. I'm joined today by John Winkle, Senior Grants Management Specialist at FRA's Grant and Loan Program Development Division, as well as Ryan Arbuckle, Transportation Industry Analyst in the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division as well. Brief overview of what we are covering today in terms of our agenda. I'm going to talk about some of the competitive grant process as just a level setting overview. We'll go into components of the project narrative and statement of work, and then give you some tools and resources, and then start with Q&A with everybody. Okay, so as you can see here, just wanted to provide some framing for our discussion today. With our discretionary grant review process, we kind of have these 4 steps. First, with intake, regarding whether the project is eligible and whether the applicant is eligible. We had a webinar on eligibility a few weeks prior that you can find on our website. The next phase is evaluation. So this is where we go into what are the project benefits. Right? Is this a capital rail project for new, expanded, or improved intercity passenger rail service? And is the applicant capable of carrying out this project? So, this is where we will be talking about the project narrative and statement of work being most relevant. Then everything moves towards selection, where projects are selected based on their ability to meet selection and evaluation criteria. And announcement, where 6 to 7 months following the application due date, we will release a press release announcing selections. Okay, so jumping right in, we'll start with the project narrative. The narrative is a core element of your application. It's usually the primary document that FRA will review to understand your proposal. You should spend a lot of effort to make the narrative as clear and comprehensive as possible. And we'll talk about that in the following slides. Just keeping in mind also that FRA's reviewers will include a range of subject matter experts who may or may not have familiarity with your particular project. So in your writing, limit jargon and explain any project-specific terms of art to ensure all of us understand what you're talking about. Okay, so first want to speak briefly about narratives and the lifecycle stage. So as you're putting together your project narrative, please structure it according to your respective track. As you can see to the right, we have project planning, project development, and full design construction as track 1, 2, and 3 respectively. So make it clear that you have completed the appropriate prerequisites for the track you are applying for. Ensure your narrative fully communicates the scope and benefits of your track and is supported by evidence. And applicants are not restricted from applying to multiple tracks. We'll talk now about best practices regarding the project narrative outline as a whole. And I'm seeing in the, I think, just to make sure everyone understands, this applies, this guidance that we're giving kind of applies to both the Fed-State partnership that is national and NEC. What you see here is actually the outline in the NOFO of the Fed-State partnership national NOFO, but please take a look at the appropriate NOFO for what you are applying for. Again, NOFO is Notice of Funding Opportunity. And there are kind of 11 elements of the project narrative that I want to go over in some high-level detail to give you a sense of what you should address in each element, as you can see listed here. Some key items to keep in mind are you need to structure your project narrative in accordance with the, of course, outline specified in the NOFO. Include all the elements identified in the outline. Make sure you follow the instructions given for each element and adhere to the 25-page limit. So there is a page limit, and we get this question a lot, but I really just want to drive the point home that your cover page does not count against the 25-page limit. So let's go ahead and dive into the first element, which is the cover page here. So in the cover page, and this is in the Notice of Funding Opportunity as well, you want to either use a table or create a list of these elements, including the project name. I'll note that, for named project titles, FRA has published guidance on developing appropriate project titles. A link to that document is provided at the end of this presentation. The information we would like to see covered in a cover page also includes the lead applicant name, project sponsor, the funding requested, proposed match, total project cost, whether or not you've submitted for a previous grant, and please state if it has been submitted to another federal grant program or if portions of the project have been funded from other federal sources. The project lifecycle stage, as mentioned, intercity passenger rail services benefiting from the project. For shared benefit projects, identify the commuter rail passenger transportation services benefiting from the project. Infrastructure owners of project assets, your location for the project, and congressional districts involved too. Okay. So the next element is the project summary. For your project summary, please be brief. So briefly describe the project in just 4 to 6 sentences. There's no need to include a lot of history or interesting tidbits that are not necessarily pertinent to the project. If you want us to know more or have more information that's optional that you want to share, please put it in an appendix. But what we want to see is kind of, answering the journalistic questions of who, what, when, where, and why. So how much are you requesting, what the project is, where it is, why this project needs to happen, as well as the application track and life cycle stage you are applying for. Make sure you keep it simple. We have this little icon here just to emphasize we don't want to have to be doing a lot of detective work, and that's not to your benefit either. So please be very clear about what you are trying to communicate. And don't front load all of your information in this summary, which is intended to be rather brief. Okay. Next, on project funding, tables are very welcome. Please include only eligible costs in your tables for project funding. Specify each source of non-federal match, and that includes providing supporting documentation, details about in-kind match, whether this is public or private sector match, and identify if the proposed match will not be available until a certain date, or if funds have to be spent by a certain deadline. So that sort of applies to state competitive funding or other competitive federal sources that you're banking on here. And for major capital projects, we had a previous info session webinar that you can see posted on our website specifically regarding these projects, as well as phased funding agreements and letters of intent. But if you are applying with a major capital project, we also would like to see an annualized budget in terms of year of expenditure dollars and whether or not you intend to seek a phased funding agreement. Include funding commitment letters outlining funding agreements as attachments or in an appendix. Of course, funding commitments must be signed by an authorized representative of the entity providing a non-federal match. If federal funding is proposed as match, we'd like to see, demonstration of the applicant's determination of eligibility for such use and the basis for that. Okay. Next, just some more best practices on speaking to the applicant and project eligibility of your application. Again, please, we always like to see you go back to look at the NOFO specifically. There are sections that very explicitly lay out eligible applicants and projects. Match your project to its eligible project type in the NOFO, and match yourself as an applicant to the eligible applicant type. And then make your case, right? So describe how your project meets the criteria and how you meet the criteria for eligibility. And also include some references of supporting documentation, citations, and hyperlinks as necessary. Okay, so the next element is in your detailed project description section. Really hone in on your project. Once again, no need to include interesting but ultimately extraneous information. Quantify whenever possible so that numbers support your qualitative statements, and highlight benefits and cost figures, even if they're already included in the benefit cost analysis portion of the application. We encourage you to include, as you see appropriate, photos and diagrams that support the information in your project narrative. And if your application is for work on a railroad where you are not the host, identify the host railroads and your agreements with them. If there are other beneficiaries to project, please identify those and include your agreements with them as well in this section. Now, to talk about the project location, identify the cities, counties, states where your project is located, as well as the congressional districts affected of your project location. be sure to include a map that clearly shows the project. Google Maps can be a good tool to use. Multiple maps, if necessary, can be helpful. We'd like to see you identify railroad mileposts, as well as geospatial data, longitude, latitude as necessary, and demographic data only if it's applicable. Another thing to mention is, include grade crossing inventory numbers in a table if your project includes grade crossing improvements. Okay. Specifically about grade crossing again, just mentioning again, cite the specific DOT National Grade Crossing Inventory information if this is applicable and relevant to your project, including the railroad that owns the infrastructure here, the primary railroad operator, DOT crossing inventory number, and the roadway at the crossing. Okay. So next, regarding evaluation and selection criteria, include a separate section in the project narrative focused on how your project meets each of the evaluation and selection criteria for the program. So this is where you can get to write your own evaluation of sorts. Please do not rely solely on the contents of the detailed project description section to satisfy this requirement. It is okay to repeat very key points in this section. And we'd like to see qualitative and quantitative benefits wherever possible. Address each component, and again, separate out each section. So this is important for us to help us kind of better understand where your project meets the criteria. Okay. Now regarding project implementation and management, this is where we'd like to see you highlight your past experiences managing and overseeing similar projects, including FRA or DOT funded projects. You can see some examples here below of relevant projects. And we'd like to see you describe expected arrangements for project contracting, contract oversight, change order management, risk management, and conformance with federal requirements for progress reporting. So, experience with intercity passenger rail, wonderful. If you are in major capital projects, the project management plans have a few additional requirements that we've listed here below and that you can find in the Notice of Funding Opportunities specifically. So again, just assume your reviewers never heard of you and don't make them do a lot of detective work. Make sure what you're providing is very clear and upfront. Okay, and the next piece regarding environmental readiness, just want to touch on, if NEPA is complete, provide a copy of the document or links. If NEPA has not been started, provide detailed project description and descriptions of the setting, land use, with visuals. And if NEPA environmental review is underway, let us know what the current status is, expected completion date, and type of document here. Just keep in mind if NEPA has not been completed yet, it can take several months or years. You may need to hire a consultant with NEPA expertise, but the amount or kinds of environmental info that you're expected to provide in your application depends on the track 1, 2, or 3 of the Fed-State Partnership Program that you're applying under. And, we may be able to adopt environmental documents prepared by or for other federal agencies as relevant. Okay. Just a last summary here for everybody to keep in mind. please keep everything simple and straightforward to help your reviewer, right? So more information is good as long as it's relevant. Think about if you want to provide supporting documentation as a submission or a hyperlink. Repetition of very key information is helpful. Don't sell yourself short there. Again, just over and over, it is to your benefit to not make us do any detective work regarding where the benefits, costs, scope, project stage is of your proposed project, and what the qualitative and quantitative benefits or other aspects of your project really are. So please don't make assumptions either on that we know location or your technical expertise or more about your project than you're providing. Here we have a list of links that can be very helpful to the crafting of your project narrative. Again, this will all be posted, and so hopefully this can be helpful to you as you move forward. Great, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, John Winkle, who can talk a little bit about best practices with statement of work.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. Jenny mentioned my name is John Winkle. I am a grants manager for FRA, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the statement of work that FRA requires be submitted with all of our grant applications. A couple things before I start. When I say statement of work, I kind of mean the 4 attachments that together with attachment 1, which is our standard terms and conditions, comprise notice of grant award. That is the scope of work, the schedule, the budget, and the performance measures. We have at least 1 slide on each one of those. So I'm going to touch on each one in a little bit more detail. But keep that in mind that I'm generally referring, when I say statement of work or scope of work, I generally refer to what goes into the notice of grant award, the statement of work, scope, schedule, budget, and performance measures. Second, we do have individual slides with each of those attachments that shows a screenshot of the template. And I think at least one of them has information from our CRISI grant program. Don't let that throw you. The templates online are not pre-filled with any of our with any specific grant program information. And even if they were, our templates are pretty standard across all of our grant programs. What is a statement of work and how is it used throughout the grant lifecycle? The statement of work is a description of work that will be completed under the grant agreement. Drafting and finalizing the scope of work is a key step toward receiving a grant award. It is important that we have a good scope, schedule, budget, and also performance measures along with the grant application, because that helps our reviewers tie what will actually be done under the grant to what is described in the project narrative and the supporting documentation. And also, should your project be selected, if we have a good scope, schedule, budget at the beginning, that will eliminate back and forth as FRA and grantee exchange drafts and speed up the obligation process. FRA has gotten much, much better at obligating grants over the past 5 or 6 years, but it does still take some time. And we seem to be getting more and more money from more and more grant programs, which means more and more grants are going out. So anything we can do to expedite the obligation process helps tremendously. And that starts with a well-drafted scope, schedule, budget, and performance measures included in the grant application. Speaking of the grant application, when you're getting ready to do that drafting, review the NOFO for specific instructions on preparing the scope of work. I will say, I think Jenny probably mentioned this somewhere in her discussion, but one of the most important things that I've taken away from my time reviewing grant applications is read and follow the instructions. So the NOFO usually has all the information you need about every aspect of the application. And if you do that, it makes our jobs much easier and quicker. With regard to scopes of work, the NOFO has information on that and provides links to the 4 templates that you can download from the FRA website. I think I'm going to mention the templates 5 or 6 times over this presentation. So, and when this presentation is available, it will have the links embedded so you can go right to them on FRA's website. Maintain the format and structure of the templates. This will improve the quality of the grant application and set up the grant for success during project delivery. FRA has reviewed and refined those templates, both my office, the Office of Project Delivery, as well as our Chief Counsel's office. They are pretty much ready to go, once they're filled in with the information specific to the project. So use those templates. It will expedite our review and also help post-review should your project be selected. The statement of work is one of the key documents contained in the grant agreement. That's what I mentioned. There are 5 attachments. The guiding document for project execution and grant management during the project delivery phase. This is an example of one of our templates. This is for attachment 2, statement of work. I mentioned briefly earlier that attachment 1 is our standard terms and conditions. Each one of our programs has standard terms and conditions. There's one for Fed-State partnership. There are links on our website to the standard terms and conditions for each program. So if you want to get an idea before you apply what terms and conditions are going to apply, you can find that on our website. This is the template for our statement of work. And yeah, this is the one that has Christie information pre-filled. Don't worry about that. Like I said, they're all pretty standard across grant programs. But you can see this gives you an idea of how our grant agreements are structured. We have the title up top, and then the table of authorities. If there's anybody out there when they're submitting their application who wants to show off their legal research skills, you can try and fill this information in, but this is standard and FRA will take care of that once the grant has been awarded and we start finalizing the scope of work. And you can see the first 2 sections there, background and objective. But like I said, this template is available on our website and you can take a better look at it there. The scope, schedule, budget, and performance measures together are probably about 8 to 10 pages, maybe total, maybe a little bit more for a complex project, maybe a little bit less for a simple project. These are the components of attachment 2, which is the statement of work. Authority, background, and objective, which you saw briefly on the previous page. Project location. If you have a map, that's very helpful. Most of our grant agreements have maps in the project location. And you may have included one in the project narrative anyway. Description of work is sort of the heart of the statement of work. It's where you tell us what you're going to do. Project coordination and project coordination is who you will work with to complete the project. And project management is how the project will be managed. You'll see if you look at the templates that a lot of authority, some of objective, and a lot of project coordination and project management are pretty standard. That language is included in the templates. You can customize a little bit if you want, but probably 90% of those are the same across all of our grants. Some helpful tips: structure your statement of work in accordance with the NOFO instructions. Again, follow the instructions. And I think this is time 3 where I reference the templates. NOFO provides links to the 4 templates which are available: scope of work, schedule, budget, and performance measures, and include all elements identified in the templates. Again, should your project be selected, that will help us tremendously as we move towards obligation. This slide I'm not going to go into too much. This is probably more appropriate for a post-award call with a grantee. Description of work, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of the heart of the grant agreements. It's where we clarify what work will be done. Task 1 under the description of work is always a detailed project work plan. So when you are filling out these attachments to include with the grant application, details are helpful, but we don't want too many details. And should your project be selected, and once we get to obligation, the grant agreement itself, the schedule and budget will not have too many details, and I'll show you as we get to those slides. But the detailed project work plan will. That will have a budget broken down more than just by task, a schedule preferably with a Gantt chart. But like I said, this is probably more appropriate for a post-award call. Just want to point out that description of work, task 1, the project work plan, standard across all of our grant agreements. The language will probably be the same across any grant agreement, and the deliverables will be the same. The detailed project work plan, budget, and schedule itself, and project agreements. right, the next section of attachment 2, statement of work, the description of work, is where you will really get to talk about what you're going to do in the project. This will have fewer or more tasks depending on the work and depending what's already been done. Some of our construction projects have, for example, task 2, environmental compliance if it's not already done. Task 3, final design or preliminary engineering and final design if it's not already done. And then a task for construction. And the construction task, as noted here, you may need subtasks to fully describe the work that's going to be done. For example, if you're going to rehab 20 miles of track that includes grade crossings and bridges, then it might be helpful to have, for example, task 3A, track work, task 3B, grade crossings, and task 3C, bridges. Those will be, if your project is selected, those will be refined as we move towards obligation. But we do want to know at the application, the work that's going to be done broken down by task. Please match it up to what's included in the project narrative. And sort of the general work that will be done under each task or subtask. As I mentioned earlier, task 1 under description of work, the project work plan, is where we really get into the details of the work that will be done. This is much more of a general description, and it also helps, should your project be selected, if we ever have to amend the grant to add or reduce scope. The more specific language used here, the less leeway we have in amending it, and we may need to amend it as opposed to just updating the project work plan. But I want to make sure that this includes the work that will be done and subtasks as necessary. The last task in description of work is always project administration. Again, this is very standard. Usually the only thing that is listed in project administration is completion of the final performance report, which is due 120 days after the end of the project. We also sometimes stick language in here to clarify that some grant administration work, like reporting and invoicing, can be requested as direct costs for the grant agreement. But for purposes of submitting your application, it's generally fine to just leave the template language in there about the final performance report. All right, the next attachment is attachment 3, project schedule. You can see here there are 2 separate schedules that we use. The first one is the deliverable schedule. When you're completing this for your application, deliverables is sort of paper documents. It's not milestones. Milestones go on the next table. So the deliverables table on the left would generally be, for example, task 1, project work plan, task 2, project agreements if you need them. The deliverables will also include, if they're included in the project, draft and final NEPA documents, preliminary engineering, final design, and the final performance report. Sometimes our project managers like to see other deliverables included in there, but you will work that out with your project manager once your project is selected as you move to grant obligation. But when you're completing this for the application, the deliverables are generally the paper deliverables. The milestones schedule is the one on the right, task name, including things like initiate construction, end construction, that type of stuff, is more appropriate for this table. I think that there is something coming up recommending that all of our grant applications include realistic timeframes for schedules. So there are sort of no bonus points if something that would normally take a year, an applicant claims take 6 months. We would rather just have an accurate representation of how long you think the work will take. One other thing I want to mention about this, obviously at the time you submit an application, it's just sort of a best guess, because FRA is going to take time to review the applications, make decisions on awards, and then once you reach that point, it's going to take time to obligate the grant agreement. So the dates in here are not set in stone by any measure. They're not even set in stone once we begin to review and finalize the scope, schedule, and budget. Those dates are malleable. The best recommendation I have for this part is what I just said. Make sure that your dates are realistic for these things. If you have a categorical exclusion, maybe 30 days or 60 days is realistic for that. But if you have an EA or environmental impact statement, obviously it's going to take a little bit more time. So these dates are not malleable. They're not set in stone. They're malleable. When you submit your application, take your best guess, and if your project gets selected, we can refine them as we move on. The next attachment is the approved project budget. We actually have 3 tables here, although the third one, I'm not sure we use that much. But the first one is the budget breakdown by task. Again, this is high level. The detailed project work plan, schedule, and budget is where you will break down individual task budgets into greater detail. But this is where you simply take the tasks as listed up above in the description of work and budget funds for them. There's one column for the FRA contribution, another column for the matching non-federal contribution, and then total. If, for example, you have subtasks probably under the construction, if you have different subtasks under your construction, then break those out in the budget as well. The next table is project budget by source. And Jenny's presentation mentioned this for the project narrative. This is where you have the percentage breakdown, federal versus match. And if, for example, you have multiple contributors to the matching funds, you can add line or add rows to this table to show, for example, if your municipality is the grantee and is contributing some, but an industry is contributing some, or a railroad is contributing some, FRA wants to see here where or who is contributing how much. And again, make sure it matches up with what's in the project narrative. The final table is budget by cost category. And I got to be honest, I have never seen this table make it through into a grant agreement, but going with the follow the instructions guidance. List what you can here. There is on our website, and there's a link to it later on in the presentation, cost category guidance that should help you complete this table. The last attachment is attachment 5, performance measures. Performance measures are something that's been a part of our grant agreements for I think the past 4 or 5 years. They basically allow FRA to determine whether or not the improvements that were claimed in the application actually happened. There are 3 listed here. Generally, 1 or 2 make it through to the eventual grant agreement. We have a list of prospective performance measures that we can choose from. However, when you're filling this out, my recommendation is to look at the project narrative, see what you claimed the project would accomplish, and then choose performance measures that would help you establish that those benefits have accrued. For track projects, we generally do things like slow order miles or travel time. For grade crossing projects, a lot of times it's simply upgrading equipment at grade crossings. But like I said, and again, I think there's a link on our websites along with the cost categories that talks about prospective performance measures. Choose ones that match what you listed in the project narrative, and then they can be refined should your project be selected as we go towards grant obligation. Here's probably the 5th time. I'm going to mention the link to the templates. All of this information is on our website. As you're preparing your application, there are instructions for statements of work in general. You can also see links to the standard terms and conditions for the various grant programs. And then the red box on the bottom highlights the links to the templates for the statement of work, the schedule, the budget, and the performance measures. Best practices, statement of work. Organize the scope of work into discrete and logically sequenced tasks. Provide appropriate timing for tasks. Identify the deliverables required to communicate progress and completion of tasks to FRA. Check the budget to ensure numbers are consistent with cost information submitted in forms and other areas of the application. Again, these things make it easier to review and evaluate applications. And help not, if things are not consistent throughout them, then obviously that will raise questions with our application reviewers and through the evaluation process. And again, if this information is accurate and consistent, then should your project be selected, it will speed up the obligation process. Finally, I'm going to admit capital cost estimating is not my thing, but as mentioned before in the cost categories table in the budget, there is a link on our website that discusses cost categories. And there's also a link on our website to help capital to help with evaluating what your budget's going to be. So as you're preparing your application, like I said, please check our website. It is a wealth of information for everything, both not only scope, but also or developing scope, schedule, budget, and performance measures, but also other steps in the application process. And once this presentation is available, all the links will be there.
Thank you all for joining us today for the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program Information Session, Project Narrative and Statement of Work. A recording of today's information session will be available on FRA's website in the next week. The information session will end in 20 seconds. Please copy or screenshot the content information on the screen. Please note, we will email all web links to you after the event. This information session has ended. Thank you so much for joining us.